Okie dokie. Macy and I have officially titled this segment At Homes with Geopolitics, featuring Cynthia Chung from the Rising Tide Foundation. This is to basically all of our Albertan Calgarians out there because recently, about a month ago, actually, just over, I think a week over, on June 6th, to commemorate D-Day, there was an unveiling of a Winston Churchill statue downtown Calgary. Now, me and Macy, our whole clan, through the works of you and Matthew, understand that Winston Churchill is not exactly a figure to be dedicating a whole bronze statue for, especially when you could use the bronze for future like electronic, projects. So that's just me. And me and Macy are also politically involved. So we know people that are involved in, for example, there is a Sir Winston Churchill Society in Calgary. And not only are we aware of those figures, but even some of the political figures, our own premier, looks at Winston Churchill as something to be applauded and maybe idealized is no, it's not too strong of a word because there's a whole society designated towards him in Calgary. So there's definitely some idealization going on there. And both me and Macy thought it would be a great idea to have you on since we've listened to so many of your podcasts. Of course, you're going to link more things than I could explain because I haven't done the same deep dive that you have. And I haven't been fortunate enough to read your book yet, The Black Sun of Which the Empire Never Sets. That's actually going to be our next book reading. After we finish Master and His Emissary, we're going to go through your book.
Really?
Yes, yes, and I am absolutely stoked because I've been doing a lot of Gladio podcasts from you recently, so it's in my zeitgeist and I really want to get it in.
Oh, what an honor.
Yes, no, we just have to do it justice. But in the meantime, to kickstart this thing, we will have Macy read the Calgary Herald thing so you can soak in the lovely propaganda that us fellow Calgarians have been toted.
Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
Favoritism.
All right, then I guess I can get started. I'm gonna zoom in. Okay. Sir Winston Churchill statue unveiled in downtown Calgary. Churchill, who died in 1965, was a longtime British parliamentarian who twice served as the UK's Prime Minister. A statue depicting Second World War leader Sir Winston Churchill now stands larger than life, much like the man himself, outside of the provincial government's Calgary offices. Officials unveiled a 3-meter tall bronze statue of Churchill, the British wartime prime minister who led the United Kingdom through the Second World War, outside downtown Calgary's McDougall Centre on Thursday. The event coincided with the 80th anniversary of D-Day, when 160,000 Allied troops, 14,000 Canadian, stormed the beaches of Normandy, an invasion that led to the liberation of France and hastened the defeat of the Nazi regime. It's quite fitting that today we are unveiling a statue commemorating one of the greatest leaders of all time, said Premier Danielle Smith. Sir Winston Churchill's unwavering defense of democracy in the face of tyranny, injustice, and oppression is one of the reasons why we are free to gather here today. The towering effigy crafted by Edmonton sculptor Danek Medensky is the culmination of years' work by Sir Winston Churchill Society of Calgary, which raised more than $300,000 for the design and creation of the statue. Winston Churchill was key to preserving freedom and democracy, not only for his country, but ours and other nations, said Mark Milkey, the Society's president. Churchill, who died in 1965, was a longtime British parliamentarian who twice served as the UK's Prime Minister. Remembered for his rousing speeches and leadership, he was a key figure in the Allies' effort to dismantle the Nazi regime that had threatened Europe during the Second World War. Churchill's great-grandson, Randolph Churchill III, traveled from the UK for the statue's unveiling. Randolph spoke of his great-grandfather's love for Canada, and more specifically for Alberta, cultivated during a week-long visit to the province in 1929. My great-grandfather absolutely adored his trips to the oil fields and particularly out to Banff, which he captured in all the dazzling light and color that I enjoyed there yesterday, said Randolph of Churchill's famous paintings of the Rocky Mountains. Former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is a member of the local Churchill Society and was a proponent of the project during his time in office. He said the sculpture faces southwest toward the oil fields of Turner Valley and the eastern slopes of the Rockies, in part to honor Churchill's 1929 visit. Churchill personifies the fight for freedom against tyranny, said Kenney. A lot of cities around the world have Churchill monuments that remember this. The greatest champion of parliamentary democracy, and Calgary deserves the same. And then we have protesters decry statue. A small group of protesters emerged as officials removed the tarp for the sculpture. They raised signs emblazoned with quotes from the former British Prime Minister, highlighting some problematic sentiments from a man they say was more controversial than the day's speeches had recognized. Historians have noted Churchill as a divisive figure. While largely remembered as one of the political heroes of the Second World War, critics often point to his history of racist remarks and policy as one of the leaders of the colonial British Empire. We don't think there should be a celebratory statue to this extremely controversial political figure, said protester William Gillies. This is 2024. Everything we put on these signs, these disgusting racist quotes, are things that are verifiable, incitable things that Winston Churchill said. Randolph said the demonstration Thursday was simply part of the debate. Actually, I would say that the people who've come with their message today have debated with dignity, he said. Going on. Kennedy admitted Churchill was a product of his time and made mistakes, but without him, oh, sorry, Kenney. I don't know if I said Kennedy or not. Kenney admitted Churchill was a product of his time and made mistakes, but without him, the Nazi terror likely would have gone on for years, if not decades longer. Well, while he disagreed with the protesters' message, claiming the quotes were presented without context and uttered in some cases more than 100 years ago, Kenney acknowledged their right to be there. They've got freedom of speech, something that Churchill fought for, and I think he'd be happy to see people free to openly criticize him, said Kenney. But I think it's important that we also remember the greatness of the man and his achievements. So I can stop that there. Oh my gosh. Oof, that's annoying.
Yeah, so I don't know if, did you guys want to share some of your thoughts first, since you live in Calgary? Did you want to maybe share some of like what your perceptions are of what this is, and the fact too, like that the statue clearly has a connection with the oil fields of Calgary, and clearly this is something that Alberta is proud about, because this is what has allowed it to be an actual economy in Canada compared to most of the rest of Canada. But how is Churchill, regarding those oil fields? I would argue it wasn't for the benefit of the Calgarians.
I love how
Or I can
saucy.
or I can maybe share a few quotes, actually, because just you reading that article made me think of some important things to maybe share with the audience in terms of some quotes from Churchill, because I think that there's a real problem also when we look at people. Clearly, everyone is flawed, even our best leaders are flawed, they're human. But how do you judge flaws that are so serious of a flaw that it is an issue with that person's legacy and what that person actually stood for, versus a flaw that is a more forgivable thing? Because obviously you wouldn't expect a leader to make absolutely no mistakes and be absolutely perfect. But I find that, this is a kind of lazy form of reasoning, that if you want to call someone a hero, they better be, representing something that ultimately is a heroic, legacy, and foreign policy and domestic policy and so forth. And I think that Churchill absolutely didn't represent any of those things. And I think that the stories of his role in India are probably the most atrocious, to the point that his speeches in Parliament that were calling for the starvation of millions of Indians, he was even booed and heckled within the British Parliament, right? Like this was very extreme and radical, considered radical even for his time. So it wasn't even like, oh, Churchill's a man of his time, and this is how everybody thought. This was already considered monstrous what he was saying. And recently, The Guardian too had an article talking about how, because the famines in India, there's this the apologists, because there's so many apologists for Churchill. They love to keep making excuses for why Churchill messes up left, right, and center. The famines in India were totally attributed to Churchill's policies, and even The Guardian said that this was the case, because for the longest time they were saying that it was due to drought, because it's true. There are many countries in Asia were suffering from famines due to drought. Also, there's always an economic policy as well behind that. But, drought does make it really difficult. And India had a long history of famines from drought. And so they were trying to blame the Bengal famine on drought. And the data is in, and we know that the drought was not, there's no excuse for the weather phenomena for the Bengal famine. And even The Guardian has an article out. I don't remember the title, but I have it in my book, where they're saying that it's most definitely from Churchill's policies. Maybe I'll share a quote that I think very much encapsulates how Churchill viewed the rest of the world in relationship to the British Empire, which he never wavered on. He was always very consistent on this view. And we can also then talk about how that would relate to other countries, including Canada and Calgarians. I guess I'll just share the screen actually, and go from there. Can you guys see?
Yeah.
So yeah, this is from chapter 2 of my book, and there's an article that Churchill published in 1930, where he talks about the United States of Europe, which is a confusing term, but I'm going to explain it further. But I just want to read part of the quote first. Churchill writes, "The resuscitation of the pan-European idea is largely identified with Count Coudenhove-Kalergi," and I'll explain who that is in a moment. "The League of Nations, from which the United States have so imprudently, considering their vast and increasing interest, absented themselves, has perforce become, in fact, if not in form, primarily a European institution." So maybe I'll explain a little bit, because I'm realizing it'll be hard for people to follow. So Count Coudenhove-Kalergi is actually the spiritual father of the European Union. He's the one who actually came up with the pan-European idea, which is pretty much what has shaped what the European Union is today. And they were making an argument. Kalergi was really spearheading this argument that we needed a United States of Europe. And what he was claiming was that, because the United States had started out as 13 colonies, and the way that the United States became an economic powerhouse was that they had formed an economic system, a banking system, a common currency, a certain trading policy amongst these 13 colonies that allowed it to start having communication, rather than everyone acting as some kind of isolated satellite of their own. And so this really was a massive boost for the United States, and it was largely using the Hamiltonian economics. And later on we would have Germany, Japan, Russia, China. Many countries were modeling themselves off of this American system structure that was under Hamilton. In the case of Germany, it was Friedrich List with the Zollverein. And so it was because Europe was in a position where it was not, it was understood, after World War One, basically we went from a system of having empires. You had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had, a certain idea of, the French Empire, the British Empire, and the Polish Empire, and so forth. But a lot of these empires kind of just collapsed after the First World War because they weren't doing so well. And the British Empire was also not doing great. They had to reorient themselves in terms of their relationship to the outside in order to, kind of continue as a force within the world, which I'll explain in a moment. But the point being is that most of the empires were collapsing, and there were republics that were being formed, which was, they were not stable situations though, because it wasn't really earned by the people either in many ways. And there was a lot of confusion as well, as in terms of like what was going to be at the foundation of the republic at the end of the day. And Kalergi was using what was a sophistry, basically, in trying to act like Europe with the European Union, right? That Europe could become stronger if they united, like how the United States had done with its 13 colonies. And at first that sounds like a nice offer, but it was the reverse. It was basically a trap to have sovereign nation states sign away their sovereignty so that they could become, something within a larger central jurisdiction that would have control over them, which is what the European Union is today, right? The European countries, except for Britain, of course, because Britain is always exempted from this, and it'll become clear why that is the case. All of the European countries don't have control over what their military does, what their banking system
Mm.
does, their economies, even their politics. There's like a central, European Union bureau that is also somehow playing a role in even the politics and how countries should be deciding, how they react to certain things. So this has totally crippled even countries like France that had a certain amount of sovereignty. These countries really don't have a large say in what happens in their future. So I think it should be quite evident now that it was the trap that it was, and it was never a real promise to become like a United States, because all of these European countries were sovereign nation states. The goal of the United States was to become a sovereign nation state. A lot of these countries already had that. France had that legacy. Italy, it's a complicated because they only had like independence and were unified actually quite late in the game, in like the late 1800s. So they were always, not in a great place. Germany too was kind of late. It was like the mid, 1850s abouts, or again late 1800s, where Germany was also becoming sovereign. So people understood that in order to like resist, in order to have some, I guess, stability, you needed to have some kind of power in your economics, your military, and politically. And so it was sold to them that it would be better if they united. Again, so it was a trap. And the trap was also within a League of Nations structure. So the League of Nations that Churchill is always talking about, and the way that because there's a lot of like controlled opposition stuff too. People pretend that they don't like each other and stuff like that. I guarantee you that you can tell whether someone is truthful or not. Like a Bertrand Russell will constantly, change what side he's playing on. He's always, though, or H.G. Wells, they're always consistently, though, backing a League of Nations orientation. So these kinds of people, they will never criticize the League of Nations construct. And the League of Nations was basically the concept of a return to empire, but it's a lie. They say a League of Nations. It's not. It's a return to empire. Kalergi, had his romance with reviving the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His family comes from, that, you know, that he views himself as a sort of representation of the aristocracy of that empire. But it's basically, you know, about 6 or 7 empires of the world. So you'd have like, you know, Austro-Hungary, you'd have like the French Empire, you'd have the German-Austrian, maybe like fitting outside of the Austro-Hungarian, and the Japanese, and then the American Empire. The American Empire was vital to go along with this because America was such a powerhouse. And so you'd have you know, so many empires, and then everyone else would be basically a plantation, a satrapy of these empires. But even Churchill will make clear in this quote that even amongst all of these empires, the British Empire will always be above all the rest. So I'll continue reading the quote. Count Coudenhove-Kalergi proposes to concentrate European forces, interests, and sentiments in a single branch which, if it grew, would become the trunk itself, and thus acquire obvious predominance. For how mighty Europe is but for its divisions? Let Russia slide back, as Count Kalergi proposes, and as it already so largely a fact, into Asia. Let the British Empire, excluded in his plan, realize its own world spread ideal. So again, British Empire is excluded, always to be above everything else. Even so, the massive Europe, once united, once federalized or partially federalized, once continentally self-conscious, Europe with its African and Asiatic possessions and plantations would constitute an organism beyond compare. By the way, Mussolini was also for this plan. Kalergi, in his several autobiographies, is very openly pro-fascist. And Kalergi had already written openly about his pro-fascist stance before 1930. And Churchill is clearly promoting Kalergi as the poster representation of what will be the European idea. That's not a coincidence. And I'll just read the second part of the quote. I'll read what I have here. I don't actually remember what I wrote, but notice that the concept of a European Union and a British Empire, aka the British Commonwealth of Nations, have no means of existing and supporting its demanded standard of living without its African and Asiatic possessions and plantations. So much for the democracy for everybody, right? As its economic support base. This is a fact that remains just as true today. Churchill has also made clear that within this League of Nations vision for the world, the British Empire is a sort of free agent, left to realize its own world spread ideal. So Churchill continues, and then I'll have us talk about this. The attitude of Great Britain toward European unification or federal links would, in the first instance, be determined by her dominant conception of a united British Empire. Every step that tends to make Europe more prosperous and more peaceful is conducive to British interests. But even this compulsive conception must be reconciled with other forms of British interest. The policy of Canning has endowed us with holdings and connections in South America, and notably the Argentine, which, although in no way affecting the sovereignty of independent states, are of solid and durable importance to us. The scheme of a British Empire, economically self-conscious, a commercial unit, even perhaps a fiscal unit, can never be widely expressed in exclusive terms. Here, then, is an aspect of the British Empire which the people of the United States would do well to study. Because again, he says, you know, at the beginning that the United States has bowed out of this idea of the United States of Europe because Kalergi had visited the United States and he was trying to have Franklin Roosevelt, back up this League of Nations plan, and Roosevelt refused to even meet with him. So it was a clear refusal from the United States to back it up, and they were going to still go ahead, but clearly that was a big setback for them. So Churchill is complaining about this.
And this is why they had to get rid of him.
Yeah. For those who don't know, Roosevelt died 2 weeks before the United Nations conference. I know that he had a lot of ailments and stuff, but I still think that timing was a little bit too convenient. So Churchill goes on to say, the king's dominions circle the globe. We can never lend ourselves to any antagonism, however unlikely or remote, economic or warlike, between continents or hemispheres. We belong to no single continent, but to all. He's talking about the British Empire right now. We belong to no single continent, but to all. That's why they will have special status compared to the rest of the empires, because unlike all the other empires, they belong to every, according to them anyway, right? They belong to every continent, not to one hemisphere, but to both, as well as to the New World as to the Old. It, meaning Britain, is a great American power. It is the Australasian power. It is one of the greatest Asiatic powers. It is the leading African power. Great Britain herself has for centuries been the proved and accepted champion of European freedom. She is the center and head of the British Commonwealth of Nations. And what he means by this is basically the world empire. So, yes, I would say that's him in a nutshell. And then maybe we can talk afterwards about Gladio. And that's the dirty secret that a lot of people don't know about.
Well, like to me, it seems like Churchill's very much a fan of Kalergi's, European Union idea, and then that's reflected as the League of Nations. But it also now this like might be a punch in the face to some people. Like to us, it's not, but it's also it ties in very well into, I guess, World War II and what was going on in terms of the British Empire kind of actually funding the Nazi movement and Hitler and all that. And almost like even like the different, I guess, little dictators around that were wanting their own little piece of the pie kind of thing with even like this the Spanish one with Franco, and then Hitler, and then on top of that, just and like Trotsky and all that. So it's just all these little branches, right? And then it's like, okay, so you can have this, but the British Empire, now we get to stay on top of all of that though. And I feel like a lot of people don't actually know though what I just said, that like especially not like people down to base that are going to be like for the Churchill Society. It's like I don't think that a lot of them actually realize what these NATO secret armies are that you write about in your book. And so I think that that might be a good stepping point, because I believe that I believe they were called what Churchill's secret armies, but we also call them NATO secret armies. So
Yeah, the thing that people have to realize is that first of all, that Churchill clearly had favoritism towards the British Empire, which doesn't even mean the British people, by the way. It means the British establishment, which I guess you could say is best represented by the crown, which is more than just the monarchy. And you have the whole East India Company legacy, which is a continuation that never ended. It's still something that exists today. The City of London is also a really big center point. I mean, it's still the thing that it controls by far the majority of world finance. I think that it's lately, being challenged a bit more from Asia, but for the longest time that was it. And so it was kind of silly, I would say, like the whole like attacking the bankers, especially the Jewish bankers, for the World War II thing, which is still something ongoing right now, as if like the Jewish bankers are everything. And it's like, why does no one ever talk about the City of London, which has existed for like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years?
You said the same
Um,
thing with Panama, right? When they were coming out saying with Brett Weinstein's interview, they were pinning it on China. Look at these Chinese camps that are in Panama crossing the canal. And then you were like, okay, however, what about the fact that it's also been the center for Operation Gladio, for like decades beforehand?
Yeah, like the Chinese, there's no proof that the Chinese are doing anything other than actual construction, which is bridges and highways, which, Brett Weinstein even had an issue with that. How dare they? Because then people are going to be able to travel more easily, and it's all about getting into the United States, let alone this idea of like, hey, maybe other countries deserve to have highways and roads, because that's also very important for transportation. That's also what China is doing for Africa. Is there some kind of crazy conspiracy to build, bridges and highways and trains in Africa as well, for like some kind of, invasion of Europe? It's ridiculous. And again, there's no historical account of China ever trying to do this. There's no proof. It's all hearsay and gossip. Whereas you have the history of Operation Condor in South America, and yeah, Panama acted as the central area for Operation Condor operations. They have a computer system as well, which I forgot the acronym for it, but I have an article on this on my Substack, Through a Glass Darkly. But yeah, it was like the actual like Skynet, like from Terminator concept. Like they actually had that for Central and South America, where all of these death squads were being trained by Green Berets in Panama and elsewhere, but Panama was a real headquarters for this. And then they were being sent to Central and South America, and they were able to communicate with each other and have all of this coordination through the Panama Computer Central Command. And, there was all of this black budget for creating parallel states, which means, you have like your own, police stations, you have your own prisons, you have your own um, uh, type of black market and things like this, but it's gotten so bad that it's now kind of like, out in the open. But even what's her name? I'm really bad with remembering names, but again, her book was cited in my article on Panama that people can read on my Substack. But she was saying, they have separate cemeteries as well for the kind of murders that were happening. And this isn't like a conspiracy theory. Like the Pinochet's Chile, everyone knows that there was like mass murders that were going on, that people were being dragged out of their houses in the middle of the night, kind of thing. This is a continuation off of what happened in Germany and in Italy. And it's not a coincidence that it sounds so eerily the same, because it is the same system. And so yeah, Churchill, there's this thing called Operation Unthinkable, which Churchill put into motion after Roosevelt died. And the World War II was still going on, but it was known at that point that Germany and Japan were not going to win. Like it was just a matter of time. They were like, stalling, and that they were going to lose the war. And so Churchill lost no time. It was maybe about 6 months before the official ending of the war. He drafted Operation Unthinkable, which was to have two scenarios for the end of the war, which was that either the Soviet Union was going to invade Western Europe, or if it wasn't going to invade Western Europe, that you would still have, these, the, there was also the idea of whether to invade the Soviet Union as well. I don't know if I said that weirdly. Um, yeah, if the Soviet Union was going to invade Western Europe, or if they were going to invade the Soviet Union right away. That was like the debate. So they decided, I mean, obviously, because that would have been freaking insane. Can you imagine to try to invade the Soviet Union right after World War II, when they had over 20 million people die? And not only this, okay, the Russians clearly were the reason why World War II was won. And it's insane that in Europe they're even trying to ice out the mention of Russia. They don't want to say V Day anymore, whatever. They want to say Europe Day. I'm sorry, but fuck you guys.
No, yeah, I listened to I think both me and Macy, Matt did a The Ugly Truth About D-Day little presentation with Gordon, and I didn't know to I knew a little bit, but to the extent about what Russia did, because the war was like from like 1939 to 1945, right? And we didn't actually, even the D-Day, Battle of Normandy, that's, so praised upon us Canadians in the West, United States, didn't happen to like the last the last
Yeah, and
little
it,
bit
it
of the
was not a
war.
massive success. Like so many people died on that beach. It was like one of the dumbest strategies, but they try to make it heroic because so many people died instead of like massive incompetence. So anyway, yeah, like the German war machine, the Wehrmacht, was like totally oriented towards Russia. Like at a certain point, it was like all in, pretty much on Russia. Russia was like, and it was not looking good. Like it was not clear whether Russia was going to be able to survive this. And Stalingrad had completely been destroyed, and there was the attempt of the Russians in not Russia as a whole, but like for that city, for instance, they were trying to surrender. And I have it again in another paper of mine. It's titled on Roosevelt and Stalin, what revisionist historians don't want you to know, something like that as a title. Um, that Hitler refused any surrendering. So also the like, I'm sorry, I can't swear because if this goes up on YouTube, then I don't think that they like swearing, but um, it's such a crockery that they say these things, and then they say, oh, but this like unconditional surrender, that Roosevelt was asking for unconditional surrender by the Germans and the Japanese. It's like, yeah, damn straight that he was asking that. They needed to surrender because there needed to be people who went to prison for war crimes after what happened. Like, what the heck? Why would you want those people to continue having massive influence within those countries as if that wasn't going to be a huge problem?
Well, yeah,
And
then that's what Putin said on the Tucker interview when he gave him that history lesson, as everybody keeps calling it. He was saying, you don't understand. There are still repercussions from everything that happened. We're still fighting off. And I thought it was a bit exaggerated when because I hadn't done all of your podcasts and interviews on the the fact that what you say, the Nazis didn't really lose the war. That very fact, he's like, we're still combating fascism in, Ukraine and all these things because of what happened and the fact that Germany did get to Ukraine, they had to take it back. It's like, so even that, I thought it was exaggerated, but it really isn't. Putin said, I'm still struggling trying to deal with that cultural implication from what happened.
yeah, yeah. And Roosevelt died again before the end of World War II, so he couldn't oversee the Nuremberg trials. There was a lot of dirty dealings that happened after Roosevelt died, that was in favor of basically turning Nazis and fascists. I mean, they're the same thing for me pretty much. There's not much difference, but whatever will differentiate them. Um, that a lot of these people were overnight former Nazis, former fascists that were then brought right back into the Western intelligence apparatus. And that's like one big thing is the NATO Central Command, that was like, overseeing the Central and Eastern European affairs, because I mean that's the that was still the battleground with the Soviet Union. And people have to understand that, of course, the Soviet Union was regarding this as a threat because World War II was clearly meant to destroy them. And there was all of these Western backers that were in support of this. People have to be reminded that it's even called this officially, that the first like 6 months or so of the war is called a phony war. And Hitler had been allowed to take over the Czech military. Alex Krainer has written, a good article, series of articles on this. He also gave a class for Rising Tide for people who want to check it out. Just, write Alex Krainer Rising Tide, where the Czech military was pretty much given to Hitler by the British, and they also gave like millions of dollars from the Czech bank to Hitler. That was the Bank of England who somehow was able to do that. This is all officially recognized. This isn't, debated. Um, and the German war machine, even though Germany was still quite powerful as a military industry, the Czech military being incorporated within the German war machine was a massive boost. It like made because at the beginning, Russia and France were seriously thinking of aligning actually against the Hitler war machine. And, after all of these plays by Burton, somehow, France gets, because, France is a little bit mixed up because you have a lot of Catholic fascists that were in France. That's why you had the Vichy government and all this. So anyway, all of this stuff is happening on the eastern side, and it's only when Hitler pretty much walks into France and then you have the Vichy government. Like there wasn't much of a fight, like an official fight. You had later on the Resistance, but that was like an underground fight against when you had a French fascist government, right? The France didn't really resist it, and for like 6 months of the beginning of the war, there was nothing done until Hitler did that. And then Britain, was saying like, okay, we'll start to do something, but there's a lot of foot dragging about this. And again, I write about that in that article on Roosevelt and Stalin. And so the German machine is pretty much mostly because you can see there's a total different treatment for the Western countries. In France, it was clear he wasn't trying to slaughter a whole bunch of French people and put them in concentration camps. Is a completely different idea for what was the plan for Western Europe versus Eastern Europe, which is a bunch of Slavs, and continuing on to Russia. And Russia has a big history with Eastern Europe, whether people like it or not. And the Polish were actually a really horrible, oppressive empire that nobody ever talks about. The Polish were actually extremely brutal, and it doesn't sound like a very friendly empire at all. And that was actually what Bandera was, what radicalized sections like Bandera in Ukraine was because they had lived under the Polish Empire. They were treated as subhuman. But that was because, there was a weird, Galicia had like a weird, relationship with Poland and then later Austro-Hungary. But it was Poland that they were upset with. So it was never like Russia that caused that problem. So I find that that's also really never talked about. But it was because of Roosevelt sending resources to Stalin. So every month, and I have the stats on the Roosevelt Stalin article. Every month he was sending like crazy. Actually, let me find this because like the stats are actually really crazy for this.
Yeah, and I'll put all these articles and interviews you're alluding to in the description when this is uploaded, because I haven't gotten a chance to look at these yet myself. And even this Polish thing, I'm reading an essay on Madame Curie right now, and it talked about how her family was Polish and they were very, very oppressed in like I think it was the late 1800s, but even that, I'm still trying to piece it together and figure out these timelines because there's so much nuance. And I think that's what you were alluding to at the very beginning of this is that nobody should really be treated as such, as if they are something above reality. People, they had, like you said, everybody has flaws. There's always this nuance, even the British Empire. And that's the one thing.
Yeah, there's no problem in admiring someone, but worshiping is always very dangerous. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, there's the difference between religion and then faith. Religion is that's when the dogma starts to creep in. Also acknowledging the fact that there are a bunch of oligarchies that have been co-opting religion since the beginning of time. But it's just takes that little step and understanding the brain and how that one step is how you end up falling into the holes of the oligarchy and then the us versus them, because you go to worship and then you make an ideology around this person. But understanding the nuance of what you said, you and Matthew always talk about the two versions of every country. Even in Britain, I didn't know at the beginning when I started your guys' work that there was a Britain civil war, and there's a revolution that people in Britain were trying to push back against this the City of London oligarchy that's been there since God knows how long. It's like even they were trying to push back, and this happens in every country. There's always the deep state and people trying to, it's the everyday civilian trying to push back against it because they know it's wrong. So, and just from keeping that nuance in mind, even for,
Mhm. Yeah, it's been about 500 years for the City of London at least, but there are even things before that that existed hundreds of years before. So it's something that's been around for a long time. And again, like people have to realize that sometimes the things that you're hating on, it's because you're hearing it all the time on your podcast or whatever. And if you don't know enough, you're not going to be able to question how to get out of that box that is clearly being built for you to stay in, because it doesn't make sense to talk about the conspiracies that people are talking about without bringing the City of London in, which throws a huge wrench into how they're understanding how anything works, including these old secret societies and all of this sort of stuff. And I just want to read that quote very quickly too. So Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program was a major factor in Russia's salvation. The list of goods that Roosevelt committed to send to the Soviet Union was astounding. It included shipments. Here, I'll share screen actually. There. So yeah, it's where the highlights are. So Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program was a major factor in Russia's salvation. The list of goods that Roosevelt committed to send to the Soviet Union was astounding. It included shipments every month of 400 planes, 500 tanks, 5,000 cars, 10,000 trucks, and huge quantities of anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft guns, diesel generators, field telephones, radios, motorcycles, wheat, flour, sugar, 200,000 pairs of boots, 500,000 pairs of surgical gloves, and 15,000 amputation saws. By the end of October 1941, ships were carrying 100 bombers, 100 fighter planes, 166 tanks, all with spare parts and ammunition, plus 5,500 trucks. And he wanted to send actual naval ships too, but there was a huge he didn't have control over everything, even though he did have control over quite a bit. As president of the United States, there was a block for him to send ships, because that was going to be a really big threat to the British Empire if the Soviet Union was going to get a bunch of ships, and it was also going to be able to them to defend themselves against Japan, right? That statistic comes from Susan Butler's book, Roosevelt and Stalin, A Portrait of Friendship, something like that, if not the exact title, very close to that title. And that was the other thing, right? So Russia beat the Nazis. The Nazis were totally, as Russia does, they did that for Napoleon too, by the way. Many, wannabe world emperors have, tried to make the trip to Russia, and it never ends well for them. But this was a really close one, and if Roosevelt hadn't sent those resources, I think that the Soviet Union possibly would have fallen. But then after Russia beats the Nazis, the Americans had the audacity to ask the Russians to also go into Japan. And I think a lot of Americans don't realize that. And actually, there were people who were asking this because after Pearl Harbor happened, there were people like even Douglas MacArthur who was saying, like, I don't want to have like millions of Americans die in Japan. And so the idea was, hey, let's send the Russians into Japan. And Russia actually agreed to do this. So when World War II was still going, of course, Russia didn't want to risk, because they had a very shaky kind of agreement with Japan, and very luckily, because they kind of bluffed. They acted like they had a whole bunch of infantry stationed on the, because Russia is massive, by the way. Just think of like how much Russia had to defend in terms of territory, but Germany on one side and Japan on the other side. They lied about how many how big their military was stationed along the eastern coast, so that Japan wouldn't invade. And there was like an agreement that they weren't going to do anything if Japan wasn't going to do anything. So Japan was kind of left free to burn everything else along the Eastern Asian coast, which, by the way, people also don't talk about enough, that Japan's horrible, not just genocide, they mutilated, they tortured people obviously rape, but like really horrible forms of torture and mutilation on the Asian people, before burying them in mass graves. Um, but anyway, so once Russia is successfully beaten Germany, then Russia's like, okay, Germany is no longer a threat. We will go into Japan now. And Russia actually went into Japan, and a lot of historians say that it was actually Russia that got Japan to surrender. It wasn't the atomic bombs, as we're told. And the bombs were actually dropped when Russia was in Japan, and Russia was not given notice that
Oh,
those bombs
wow.
were going to
I
be
didn't know
dropped.
that.
So
That's a
that's how
nice way of
shitty
saying
the
thanks for your help.
Americans, yeah, that's how shitty the Americans have been. And the Russians did this because they wanted to show that they were clearly in acting in good faith, goodwill. Can we like, get along? We clearly are not going to, you know,
And we
they
repaid
didn't
them with a
have to go
Cold
into
War.
Japan. Yeah. Churchill then says, like about not even like 2 years later, that the Soviet Union is the enemy. And so here's the thing. The Operation Unthinkable, Russia never actually invaded Western Europe. And some people are so crazy to think like, oh, well, he wanted to, but he never ended up doing it. Like, listen, if we're gonna talk like this, like, you can just imagine anything that you want and then make up an excuse for why it didn't happen. It's like, it's almost like a bad form of thought crime. Like you're trying to blame someone, but it wasn't even their own thought, it's your thought, but you're insisting it was their thought. But anyway, so Russia never did that. And so Churchill's like, okay, well, we'll have the stay behind armies, which became known as Churchill's secret armies. And guess who were people who were brought into those things even while World War II actually was happening? So here's another actually dirty part of history I'm going to talk about in a moment. But you had actual Nazi, they were still Nazis, it was still during World War II, who were part of the, oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. I forgot to stop. Okay. Um, yeah, so you had actual Nazis. Again, I have it in my book that the particular name of the Nazi group that was part of the Churchill units, because they were already being organized while World War II was like near the end of World War II, because again, they knew that World War II was going to work out for the Allies, that the Germany and Japan was going to lose, and Operation Unthinkable was brought in at the very end of World War II, but like there was still about 4 months left or more. And so you had actual freaking Nazis who were part of these stay behind armies under Churchill. And then again, we had Nazis who were in charge of when NATO eventually did form. We had former Nazis, who were in charge of the Central Eastern European Command of NATO for like 17 years straight. All former Nazis. It's like about 8 or 9 people. There might be even, more than that than I'm aware of, but at least for that, time frame, for about 16 or 17 years straight, you have about eight or so, all former Nazis. There's no one who has not been a Nazi in between those commanders. And it was clear why, because the Nazis hated the Slavs and they wanted them in position for that section of the world overseeing under NATO. And NATO is a continuation of Churchill's secret armies. So anyway, these secret armies, now we know because there's been declassified material that came out, especially in the late 90s. It's one of the biggest declassifications that has ever happened, which included the Nazi files and also the Japanese fascist files that the CIA, FBI, and other intelligence institutions of the United States released. And it's like over 8.6 million pages. It's like, I think the biggest declassification of information. And obviously it took researchers years to go through the material to start actually compiling and understanding what happened. And increasingly it was understood that there was this thing called Gladio. So nobody, again, this isn't a conspiracy theory, it's officially recognized through these documents that there was such a thing as Gladio, which is the name for the Italian secret army. So every country had a secret stay behind army. And Italy was the first to be like massively publicly exposed, and so that their name was Gladio, and then it was just called for everything else. But every country has like a different name. Sorry, before I go any further on that, I just wanted to say very quickly too that during World War II, to show that Churchill is actually a fascist, and that the fascists are not pro-nation state, they're actually pro-empire and pro-monarchy, is that when the Greeks were fighting, they at first were fighting the Italian fascists under Mussolini, and they were doing a really great job. And these Greeks were Stalinists. They were communists that were Stalinists, and they were Stalinists. So that's the thing, is that not just the Soviet Union was fighting directly, but you had Stalinists in like Spain, in Greece, and many other places, and they made up the bulk. I would say only like in France was there something that was not what seemed to be, something really influenced by a Stalin network, but otherwise it was mostly Stalinists who were fighting the fascists. And so this is a very big deal that people need to realize historically, is that so the Greek Stalinists managed to fight back the Italian fascists, so they were gone. Then the Nazis came in, and the Nazis were also having a hard time. During this time, you did have British soldiers who were fighting with the Stalinists to help with fighting, because obviously, it doesn't look good if you start not fighting the fascists. But um, there was an issue where it was clear that they were going to fight back even the Nazis. And so what the British did is they created that was one of the first places, Greece, where they launched their own secret army. They made it because they were the other secret armies you could call were sleepers. The secret army in Greece was activated, and it was officially not a British army, right? It's kind of like how things work today too, in Syria and this sort of thing. Like you have these fronts that are acting for Anglo-American interests because they were trained by them, they were funded by them and everything, but people don't associate it as an Anglo-American entity. So that's what this unit was in Greece, and they were fighting the Stalinists, and so that was the British unit. But even they were having a hard time with the Stalinists. So then guess what happens? The Americans are asked to come in, and that, by this time it's the World War II is over. So this was all starting during World War II, and Churchill, there's even documents, again, it's in chapter 6 or so, the Gladio chapter in my book, where Churchill is even saying like we really cannot have this get out, that we are involved in fighting the Stalinists, who are
Mm.
pretty much fighting the Nazis and the Italian fascists, and that he was again always pro installing a monarchy. By the way, Mussolini too was not against the idea, of an emperor. Hitler was also not against the idea of being an emperor. There was always a pro-monarchy way of organizing when they were going into these countries where they totally gutted the resistance. They always wanted to put in place a monarchy, and this king was known to be pro-fascist too. I forgot his name, but again, all this information you can find in the Gladio chapter, which is actually for free on my Substack if people want to read it. So what happens is this fight continues after World War II is over. It's still happening, and I think most of the world is like not properly aware of what's going on in Greece. And so the Americans are asked to come in under Truman, and this was the first country that the United States went in, and like as a kind of like a foreign invasion type thing. It wasn't, a kind of justified situation like World War II. And they napalmed them. They napalmed the Greek people just in general. And they bombed them so badly that like Greece was kind of like totally hollowed out.
Hmm.
And Greece became then one of the first countries to be brought into NATO after being like totally destroyed. That was the Truman Doctrine that was used as an excuse. I forgot now how they were framing it, that they needed to take over Greece now because it's after World War II to protect, there's too many Stalinists in Greece, and we need to protect the Western world from Stalin. So we need to eradicate these people.
And it was so quick too, right? Like between Truman getting in right after in that same time frame, the Cold War speech, um, the Signal Agreement, and the Guzhenko affair, and the creation of NATO, which was like 1949, if I'm not mistaken, or something like that. It was like really so close after World War II. They just got right on it to start literally taking one of your biggest allies in the war, Stalin, and then flipping it on him. And they did it in less than 5 years. It was like insanity.
A lot of this gets me curious though, because I think that one of the questions that might arise in some people's brains is like, well, why Russia? You know what I mean? And I feel like obviously you and Matthew have gone down a long history of like why specifically Russia. But I feel like also it sets
I
the
mean, why
stage for
did they want to destroy Russia?
yeah, but it also sets the stage for a bigger picture in terms of also because you were mentioning near the very beginning of this that they were also kind of trying to blame everything on the Jews. You know what I mean? And so, and I believe you said I was watching one of your podcasts that you did, and you were saying that it was actually Kalergi's father who was saying that there's like Reformed Jews and non-reformist Jews, right? And that's funny because I was listening to Richard Poe's work, and he was saying that Churchill made in one of his articles the exact thing, saying that there's bad Jews and there's good Jews. And the good Jews are the ones that are pushing for this greater Israel Zionist like push, right? And and then the bad Jews would be the ones that were affiliated with like the Russians. And so I'm like, okay, so this kind of pans out into a bigger picture of like why specifically are they trying to stir stuff in these specific parts of the Middle East, and how does that relate to why they're trying to stir up Russia, especially even now today with their Ukraine war, going after World War III for this thermal nuclear war project. It's like, what? I know that's like a huge question, actually, if you were to deep dive in it, but
It's a really
what?
good question.
But yeah, so what do you think is like the connection there, and why specifically that?
Sure. I will answer that. I just want to finish with the Gladio thing just for the sake of the readers who don't know anything about what I was talking about, which was that these secret armies continued along with NATO. So it was working with NATO, and it was under Churchill's whole, plan, but the communist invasion never happened. And so it's now been recorded that these secret armies started to attack the citizens of these countries to terrorize them, and they were placing it as false flags. So they were blaming it on communists, these terrorist acts, and then they were using them to try to coax people towards far right-wing governments. But also, not only this, but they were responsible for the assassination of even democratically elected leaders who didn't even necessarily have like any kind of relationship with the Soviet Union at all. And Olaf Palm is also a very famous name that's associated with this. Enrico Mattei, is one of these very good people who was assassinated. None of these people had like, they're not Stalinists by any measure. De Gaulle was also, he had multiple attempts on him. He was not a Stalinist, but it was so crazy that people were, if you were not for war, you were called a Stalinist kind of thing. Like if you were not for war with Russia, you were like called a Stalinist. And that was the same thing with Kennedy, right? Like that pamphlet that was passed out like a few days before he was assassinated, they were they were calling him a communist. Like it was becoming really dumb with like who was being called a communist at this point. And it was really at the end of the day attacking true democracy, true nation state towards far right wing governments, which would ultimately align towards a central command, which is always under a League of Nations construct. So the League of Nations construct is still valid today. So that's partially, answering your question, Macy, is like what is all of this towards? It's for the League of Nations construct. So the United States and Russia in particular during that time were the biggest resistance towards that. And you can see that very clearly during America's own Civil War, during Lincoln's presidency, where you have again that great quote from Tsar Alexander II. Okay, so this is again another article, Why Russia Saved the United States, on my Substack. So Tsar Alexander II gave an interview with the American banker Wharton Barker on August 17th, 1879, where he says, and it was published in 1904, where he says, in the autumn of 1862, the governments of France and Great Britain proposed to Russia, in a formal but not in an official way, the joint recognition by European powers of the independence of the Confederate States of America. My immediate answer was, I will not cooperate in such action, and I will not acquiesce. On the contrary, I shall accept the recognition of the independence of the Confederate States by France and Great Britain as a casus belli for Russia. And in order that the governments of France, and I believe it was Napoleon III who was in charge of France at this time, because France was originally an ally of the United States in the American Revolution, right? But then you had the Napoleons, the Bonapartes that came in, and they were not good. So the recognition of the independence of the Confederate States by France and Great Britain as a casus belli for Russia. And in order that the governments of France and Great Britain may understand that this is no idle threat, I will send a Pacific fleet to San Francisco and an Atlantic fleet to New York. All this I did because of love for my own dear Russia, rather than for love of the American Republic. I acted thus because I understood that Russia would have a more serious task to perform if the American Republic, with advanced industrial development, were broken up, and Great Britain should be left in control of most branches of modern industrial development. And I really feel that that says it in a nutshell there, is that and again, this tells you it's not a communist thing, right? The what Russia represents is not something that you can just say was like, oh, it was Stalin or whatever. This is a continuation of Russia under Tsar Alexander II to Stalin, resisting what Great Britain represents as its form of an economic system that's based on slavery and a kind of feudalism that is equated to slavery, where large sections of the world are going to be plantations and so forth. That's why there's this backing of the Confederate States, and the Confederate States plantations, their cotton plantations. Guess what? Who they were getting paid by? Great Britain, the country that supposedly got rid of slavery and blah 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 blah. Yeah, they were still using slavery everywhere else in the world. And by the way, the working conditions for their own people in these cotton factories were horrendous. And there's actually a lot of books, Charles Dickens, but other, people have written about it, where the people who've worked in these cotton factories, a lot of them being women and children, because it wasn't like, physically intensive work. The cotton was going into their lungs. The cotton was like floating all around in the air, and they were breathing this in, and they were slowly suffocating. Um, and there was no choice. They couldn't choose to work another job if they could. Like if you were born in this one district, then you would live your whole life in that district in that squalor, and you would go work at that one factory that's by where you live, and that was your life. So for me, that's not, that's pretty close to a slave's life, if you ask me. sure, they had to voluntarily go or starve to death. Those were the choices. Um, and then the
Uh,
other,
Can I just add something to that
yeah.
actually? So
Mhm.
just like to piece together a bit of a like big picture aspect to this, I kind of go like me and my family, we do a lot of work on like the hemisphere dynamic of things, and that's why even on the channel you'll see we have our little book discussions there. But one of the things that we know is that without much context, this might not make much sense, but hopefully it'll like dampen your taste palette, right? Which is that we say the left hemisphere likes to assume that everybody thinks the way I think, right? And so if you have some oligarchical power like the British Empire that's trying for this League of Nations type idea where they're like, I want to impose my will on everything, because again we also downstream kind of tie that into the hemispheres, and we kind of explain as to why a part of our brain does this thing where it wants this ultimate power, it wants this comfortability, control, right? It's this, it can be on the micro to the macro, right? And that's exactly what we are seeing when it comes to this oligarchical power. But it goes back into what Maddie and was saying because of you and Matthew's work, which is awesome, is the fact that there's two types of versions of things, right? So even with Great Britain and like the British Empire and how we attribute it a lot to like right now in the scenario that's like, hold on now, like they're actually more so the baddies than what it is that we've been led to believe were the baddies, like with the Soviet Union and all that, right? But I think that when it comes to the idea of this feudalistic system and also just needing to get, I guess, this gladio operations going, like why the division, why all the stirring of things, right? To keep that, I guess, feudalistic nobility breadbasket picture of what's going on. I think it's not just because a lot of people can attribute it to, well, it's for money. And that's very true. Like that plays a big role, but it also has to do with comfortability as well. Like it is a psychological, like, no, we think our will is the right way. We think it's right. It's what we know. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Those type of basic mentalities. But also, it's going back to why I'm saying sometimes people think, well, everybody thinks the way I think, right? It's like, because I was thinking about this the other day listening to a podcast, and I was like, what Russia and China right now, project wise, are doing. It's like, why wouldn't you want to get on board on BRICS and join in this? Like, to me, I'm like, common sense says do this thing, but they are not doing this thing. And I was like, well, why? Why is that? Is it just for money? And then I was like, well, no, I don't think it's just for that. I also think that it's like, if they were to, I guess, go along with that, the uncomfortability and uncertainty with maybe the idea in their own heads that, well, then that means that Russia wants their own ultimate power and dominance because that's what I want. And so again, you're assuming that they think the way that you think. So you're like, well, that can't happen. I can't allow that to happen. And then same thing with China. And so whereas you're not understanding that it's like, no, what Russia and China are aiming towards is more so this idea of cooperation, hence why they've invited you to come onto these projects. Let's work on space projects together. Let's just basically explore as human beings what is our potential, right? But that's not, and we kind of again attribute it to left hemisphere and right hemisphere, almost war of hemispheres, because like what all of these have in common is human beings who have brains, right? So we're like, well, I almost go like Russia and China are kind of acting like the right hemisphere ping, and they're going like, hey, now let's consider other people. Let's do like the thing that's good for all humanity. And then the British oligarchy, or again, because I don't want to necessarily always be like British pumping, but I want to, because like there's again two versions of everything. So there's also deep states within Russia, within Germany, and within France, and it takes two to tango type thing. So it's like, yes, was it them having an infiltrative like way to infiltrate these different countries? Was it primarily a lot because of the British Empire and all that? Yes. But also the fact that there were consenting officials that obviously have chosen to do this thing, hence why in the French Revolution you can even have a Napoleon in the first place, right? It's like there's still those aspects of these are individuals where they're okay with the thing, because that again, this idea for power and control and comfortability for lots of different reasons that are complex it's in every human being, right? So I just wanted to like add that to like the bigger picture, because again, also like why do the whole Russia thing and trying to push this Zionist Greater Israel, and then it plays into like trade routes and like what Russia and China are trying to do with the BRICS nations in terms of building railways. It's like even that plays its role, because the British Empire, right, was maritime at the time, or maritime empire, right? So they had to mainly go along with sea routes. And then if Russia and China and the US got together and were like, well, you know what we could do? We could just cut out the middleman and just do it ourselves. The British Empire don't get anything from that. So they're like, well, excuse me. So of course they're going to try and subvert that. But so that was just my little like trying to put in some context. But
Yeah, and I think that's really useful. And I don't want people to get the idea that there's like something against the British people. And just to be clear, the British people were also treated badly they're continuously treated badly under the system. And it's more about, as you were talking about, it's an ideology. So like the British Empire doesn't have a love for what you could call is the best of British culture, the Shakespeares, and so forth. There's a lot about the British culture that is really good, and there was until not that long ago, anyway. Still a lot more interesting sort of political debates that were happening in Britain that you would hear compared to other democratic nations, I would say, although it's really tough in Britain because things are quite controlled still. But it's not about the British culture or the British nation state. What I'm talking about is something that actually wanted to kill the nation state. And that's I think the thing that we're talking about when you're saying that every country has like two sides. It has the side that can be radicalized in one way or another. So we have to be aware, right, that like our cultural identity, our heritage, our story as a people, that's important. I'm not, and that's why, that was the false blame, was that the Nazis and the fascists were a logical outcome to nation state. That's not true at all. They were anti-nation state. They are imperialists. They are all like wannabe emperors. It's not a nation state construct, and they're not going to care about what the people choose, in these situations. I think that was made very clear. But so you have these things that will want to destroy what is a proper nation state. So a proper nation state, the way that Matthew and I have defined this, and you can see from historical examples, again, with the Hamiltonian system, with the Friedrich List system of the Zollverein, things that it's very closely tied to economics. And economics is usually the first thing that happens, is that you have to have economic stability. You have to have, because that's also what causes, a lot of these areas to be radicalized. Ukraine, for instance, guess when the neo-Nazi groupings started in Ukraine? Pretty much the year that the Soviet Union dissolved and Ukraine was no longer under the Soviet Union, but the Ukraine then signed on with IMF and they went into massive debt. I have a
Oh,
statistic in one of my articles actually that I can probably find pretty quickly. It's quite amazing. Ukraine was gutted economically, not by the Soviet Union, so they were actually doing the best economically under the Soviet Union. And again, I want to make it clear, I'm not a communist. I don't identify with, I don't think that communism is the right answer. However, we can't look at the reality of economic statistics and just, try to claim that things didn't, happen that did happen.
yeah, I like
So
what Gerald said in his Mary Shelley presentation. He's in the Q&A. He's like, I'm not a fan of isms. I don't care what ism it is. I don't like it. It's like, fair enough, dude. It's what all those labels, it's like communism, fascism, you name it. It's like you're just putting a very blatant label on something that is far more complicated.
yeah, And usually, especially with like a term like communism, there's so many different groupings that have called themselves communist, like including Trotskyists, that it's like it doesn't represent one specific thing.
Yeah.
And for me, the term fascism is often misused nowadays. Like I tend to use it for people who really identified as fascists, like the Italian fascist during World War II, the Japanese fascist. Like this is a label that they use, but I try not to use it, for other things unless, it's very blatant. But yeah, so for Ukraine used to be among the richest countries in Eastern Europe, known as the breadbasket of Europe. However, this economic fact is harder and harder to come by since Ukraine was part of the USSR. In other words, people don't want to admit this because it was under the Soviet Union.
Mm.
When their economy was at its peak, a most inconvenient truth. It is for this reason that you will be hard pressed to find any GDP graph of Ukraine that begins earlier than 1991, the date of
Wow.
their independence, their so called independence. They were
Mm.
never really independent. By the way, Ukraine is another country that was never really a country. I think a lot of Westerners, they don't really understand that a lot of the Eastern countries never really were allowed to become countries. Like I said, during World War One, you had all of these countries like republics or nation states in name that formed, but they were never actually independent enough to not be pressured by other entities that kind of took control of how their country functioned. And Ukraine's one of those examples. So from 1991 to 1997, Ukraine lost 60% of their GDP and suffered five-digit inflation rates. Who was Ukraine
Wow.
beholden to during this massive recession that has never really ended for Ukrainians? The International Monetary Fund. So
Ooh.
again, this was the time where you had a whole bunch of neo-Nazi groups that started to come about, and there was a lot of work by the CIA. Again, this was part of the declassification material in the late 90s, that the CIA was involved in Ukraine for several decades, using Mykola Lebedь, I guess you can say the lieutenant of Stepan Bandera, so identified as a Nazi, and they were using him through the Operation Aerodynamic to radicalize Ukrainians to try to continue what was a revisionist history of their people. It's not even a true history. And this history, it's shown like it's only being talked about in the 20th century. There's nothing backing it up before then. It's like this writer from the 20th century that starts the whole thing, the whole ball rolling, and this idea of like, the trident now of Volodymyr the Great is now somehow, a representation of what they are, kind of thing in terms of them as an Übermenschen, race. They talk about inferior races, it's I anyway. Um, so that's like we have the one side that is basically anti-human, that looks at most people as something to enslave, and you can have it in different forms of systems, but they ultimately will agree overall. It will overall become something that will become imperialistic. So even, something that calls itself anarchism, for instance, Bertrand Russell calls himself
Right.
an anarchist, at least at one point. He calls himself many things throughout his career,
Mm.
but he was pro League of Nations when he wrote his book that was pro anarchy, and that was talking about Bakunin and all of these other people. Which, by the way, people need to realize that Bakunin and Trotsky were the really, in my opinion, the worst communists, but those are the communists that tend to be like given a little bit more of like, and Trotsky, it's clear that through, oh, I'm forgetting his name now, um, James Burnham
Mhm.
was the father. James Burnham was the lieutenant of Trotsky in the United States, and he worked for the OSSR and the CIA. He was, totally pumping the Truman Doctrine, where they napalmed the Greek Stalinists
The father of
because how dare they fight the
neoconservatism, right?
Nazis and the Italian fascists. And then he was the spiritual father of the neoconservative movement. And a lot of people like don't talk about this enough, of like how, you know, it's so ironic that you have like this whole communist hate on, and like the neoconservatives are like are very clearly a shaping of that. You know, when Pelosi went to visit Taiwan just a few years ago, it was deranged. You had like the Democrats and the Republicans who were all agreeing with each other and patting each other on the back. And I think that that should have really told people where these people really stand at the end of the day. And that's what you see. You see all of these groupings that apparently represent different things, but at the end of the day, they'll all agree on who to burn. How convenient. Uh, and they're ultimately all for the same system. And the people who are higher up in the grouping, they will understand that you'll always get like dupes who will be romantics, whether they be Nazis or communist or whatnot. But the there is an alignment that is always going to be an anti-human sort of imperialistic construct versus something that it is pro-human and wants to use, you know, economic development for the welfare of others. And this isn't like a pipe dream. It's happened historically. We have historical examples of this. So these people who are blackpilled and try to deny this ever happened, it happened many times, and there was sabotage. So you have to understand what sabotaged it. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting blindly in the dark. And so for me, I find that the best way for anyone to understand where a country or where a proposition is coming from is what is the economic policy of that proposition. Because you can see from the economic policy if it's an honest offer, if it's an honest proposal, if you can understand how a proper economy works, then you will know that this is a good thing. And you know, people need to realize there is something philosophically viable about the idea of win-win cooperation, rather than, you know, burn the village to save the village or
Mm.
divide and conquer. That's perpetual war. That's eternal war. That doesn't bring you peace. That brings you eternal war. And these people identify with that idea. Trotsky didn't come up with that on his own. Trotsky had his handlers. He also was working for the same people as Mussolini and Hitler. Um, so that's what people have to understand, is that there is actually something genuine that's happening in the world. And, you know, we saw it too with de Gaulle and Kennedy. These were also really good examples of people who are working for that same idea of like what you're bringing up now with the Belt and Road Initiative. And now China has clearly like wavered a whole bunch of debt from these African countries. And
Right.
they've pretty much handed over one of the main rails. I forgot which one now. Um, I think it's the Djibouti railway line, to the Africans to manage, because obviously you don't want to hand it over right away because you put in a lot of money. You want to make sure that everyone's properly trained, sufficiently trained to deal with it on their own. And now and also there are so many Americans that are being trained in Chinese universities to return back to Africa and to become, you know, leaders and to manage these like projects that require you to have like a high level of engineering knowledge. So that's what China has done now. It's very provable. IMF, World Bank loans, those have existed for a much longer time, and it's very clear, you know, where that led. And also the fact that City of London is responsible for capital flight, all types of looting from these African countries, on top of asking for enormous interest rates, and then telling the African countries what they can use that borrowed money for. They can't even decide what they want to use the money for. That's why they don't have an electrical grid right now. They don't
Mm.
have roads right now. It was China that's like now offering these clearly basic things for the African people. And the whole Sri Lanka thing too. You break down the debt of Sri Lanka, and you see that the debt for China is I think I can probably find the graph for that really quickly. So here's the Sri Lanka debt, and you can see China, 10%. I'm good. I remembered 10%. Japan, 10%. Asian Development Bank, which by the way, mostly Japanese on that board, not China, 13 at the time anyway, 13%. World Bank 9%, other 9%, 2% India, 47% market borrowings. What are market borrowings? So we say here, so who owns this 47% market borrowings share of Sri Lanka's foreign debt? Well, according to Nikkei Asia, which is a Japanese news agency, very well respected as well, and not friendly to China, the world's largest financial newspaper based in Tokyo, Japan, sorry, that's Nikkei Asia. By the end of 2020, a year into Gotabaya's term, the country's foreign debt was 38.6 billion, accounting for 47.6% of the central government's total debt, according to the IMF. International sovereign bonds made up the largest share at 14 billion, followed by 8.8 billion in loans from multilateral lenders and 6.2 billion in bilateral debts. The top 20 international sovereign bond holders, so that make up the market borrowings, include BlackRock, Allianz, UBS, HSBC, JP Morgan Chase, and Prudential, according to Advocata Institute, a Colombo-based think tank. Oh, how interesting. So it's actually the Westerners, the Western banks, who are, and HSBC is an English, it's a British bank, even though it has Hong Kong, Shanghai. That was from the Opium War when Britain took over Hong Kong and Shanghai. Its headquarters are in the city of London. These are all Western. And they were blaming China when it's 10% China. And by the way, this graph is from Germany, DW, a very big German news agency, which is also not very friendly to China. So, how interesting. Actually, this is an interesting thing for statistics. I think I'll also just share this too. There's the Jubilee Debt Campaign, which was talking about how, if we wanted to really be serious about African welfare and not just use it to just blame China for its apparent, desire to be a hegemonic ruler, you can see the percentages here. China owns 24%, IMF and World Bank 20%, Paris Club 10%, private sector 32%, and then multilateral institutions 15%. The Center for International Policy's Africa program, based in Washington, D.C., tracks and analyzes U.S. foreign policy towards the nations of Africa. Interestingly, they conclude, as debt crisis looms, there has been a growing demand from various advocacy groups for debt cancellation and the issuance of special drawing rights from the IMF. According to the Advocacy Network for Africa, the SDRs, the special drawing rights, are the IMF's reserve currency that could enable countries to boost reserves and stabilize economies, helping minimize other economic losses without any cost to the U.S. government. Although SDRs offer African countries a lifeline, the U.S. has yet to support the initiative, adding yet another hurdle in their attempt to break free from their debt trap. In addition to advocating for SDRs, organizations like the Jubilee Debt Campaign are also urging the IMF to sell its stockpile of gold to cancel the debt of the poorest countries. According to the Jubilee Debt Campaign, the profit from selling less than 7% of IMF's gold, worth $11.8 billion, would be enough to pay for canceling all debt payments by the 73 countries eligible for the G20 debt service suspension initiative for the next 15 months, and would still leave the IMF with $26 billion more gold than the institution held at the start of the year.
Wow.
The effort of debt cancellation advocates seem to continue to fall on deaf ears as the IMF and the World Bank refuse to make any move towards canceling the debt of African countries. The bank's hypocrisy is observed in the fact that it continues to pressure China, Africa's largest creditor, who's actually building things, to cancel its debt to poor countries while itself has yet to cancel the debt it is owed.
Wow.
And China actually has canceled a lot of that debt.
Well, of course the IMF doesn't, because if they cancel it, right, then how does the interest keep stacking up? How do they get the extra money?
Yeah, I think at this point though, like that whole attack on China, it's the outcome is out now. We see that the things have been built. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why China has been very closed off in Panama, is because there's been a lot of terrorist attacks for these areas where they're building these projects. And now West Africa is one of the, coincidence, I think not, the biggest hot zone for terrorist attacks, because there is work with Russia and China in trying to stabilize the area, and the African countries are saying no to the old, colonial noose that was like around their neck, and they're, starting to make decisions and want to build projects that have not received the okay from the West. Even Germany, when Biden was elected, Germany made a deal with China on hydrocarbons, and Biden had the nerve to say to the German minister, even, how dare you make this decision with China before I was fully in office, and ask for my take on it. Like, that's even for Germany. Imagine how these other countries are treated. Anyway.
No, that just comes right back to that whole League of Nations thing you were talking about. Like that's the ideology and that's partly why, if not the main reason why, we thought doing this podcast would be a good idea, because, you know, even Alberta struggles with the whole, now that we know where Canada stands as a country, or as a vassal state for the British anyway. Understanding that, you look at even our resources, we also have, our money has to leave Alberta, and our product, our oil, we have to actually buy our oil back after exporting it externally. And then trying to do interprovincial trade is a pain in the butt. And then even countries like Quebec, in order for them to receive the payments that we do, equalization and crap like that, in order for them to get their payments, like what Africa is going through, it's like they get money under terms and conditions. Quebec can't invest into their oil products in their same fields, because then they would be making too much revenue, and then they wouldn't qualify for the payments. So it's like all these terms and conditions, and it's, even though it's on this global scale, and people, it's like, it's not what's happening in Africa, what's happening in Germany, it doesn't really affect. It's like, actually it does. It's happening here, it's happening locally. And so when I see a statue of Winston Churchill, who did the Signal Agreement and the secret armies, and then what he did in India, all of these global empirical actions, and it happens in my backyard, and then people that we're very active in politically trying to help Alberta get out of a rut, and then that happens, and I go, what do we do about this? And the best thing to do is to talk about it, because that's the passion. I am passionate about Alberta. I'm passionate about Calgary, and I'm passionate about geopolitics. Thank you, Cynthia, for giving that to me. So talking about it and asking you to come on and have this conversation with me and my sister is, it's easy. It's easy and hopefully helpful going towards the future, because this is the cultural war that we're aiming for.
Something that I want to add, just like, because I feel like we're lingering towards a close. But I wanted to say that, like, I really would encourage people who are listening, whenever year that happens to be, because I'm also thinking that way, but not to get caught in the whole dividing, don't be one of the pawns that gets caught in the divide and conquer strategy. Because even now, I'll bring it back like a bit full circle, even to like the Churchill idea, where it's like, guys, this he was the war secretary during the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, and literally helped Trotsky promulgate his I guess plot with what was going on in the Russian Civil War. And it's like, and this guy Trotsky was what Cynthia literally just described, which was just this guy who was like, permanent war and revolution, and like, we got to spread our tentacles everywhere, you know what I mean? And apparently I was listening to something, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that Trotsky was also affiliated with Jabotinsky, which I believe is what Matthew was saying, and that if that's the case, then Jabotinsky was also in charge of like the terrorist night raids that were promulgated with the Zionist movement that was like way downstream of the British oligarchy that are trying to promote this same divide and conquer strategy that we literally just witnessed with Palestine and Israel, right? So, and then I saw that during that time, like another thing to set off the neuroticism is like, oh, well, on the right side we're like Israel, and on this side we're Palestine, and blah blah blah. It's like, guys, again, coming back to what I just said, please don't be a pawn that gets stuck in the divide and conquer strategy where you're picking one side over the other, because you're not tying it into like, pay attention to who people's friends are. I feel like that's an important thing. It's like, well, you get to know a lot about a person and a country by who they surround themselves with, and the BRICS and what they're doing and what they're surrounding themselves with, they're creating a good friendship. And if you just have to watch the actions, and then you have to look at ourselves in our own backyard and be like, well, what are we doing? And then Maddie's right. It's like, then even look even less in your own backyard, and hence why looking at Alberta and comparing that to the rest of Canada, like Quebec, it's like, yes, we're as Albertans angry at the fact that we have to like keep giving out equalization payments, but let's also sympathize with the people that we're giving them to, because we're also not helping them out either, because then they can't actually start to develop themselves. So it's like this, we got to be paying attention here. But yeah.
Yeah, and I would say for people too to think about, like, the 20th century up until now has been mostly this idea of perpetual warfare. And James Burnham wrote The Managerial Revolution when I think it was in 1943. And, when he wrote it, it still looked like it was feasible that Germany and Japan were going to win. And so he said a very telling prophecy that he thought, that Germany was going to win and we should just like accept it, basically, is what he was saying. But he said that there will still be many wars that will be needed to solidify this. And he says about 16 or more wars. Very interesting comment to be writing during World War II. And that's basically what it's been, right? It has been a perpetual warfare a situation. The Americans had a moment of like resisting this, especially with the Vietnam War. There was such a disgust with that, but the 9/11 really kind of rejuvenated it for a lot of people in strange ways, because even people who recognized that 9/11 wasn't a real uh, it wasn't a natural act of, it was an inside job basically. And even the New York Times an interesting article talking about how the FBI knew that there was going to be an attack on the building like weeks beforehand. And obviously there was a lot of help. The radars had to all be shut down, and very convenient timing for all of this to happen. But that when that happened, we got back onto that path of perpetual war, and this war on terror was ironically the war of terror that we're in, and nobody is benefiting from this. You have to ask yourself: is your country better off now? Is your country more economically stable? Has the prosperity increased? Has your industry increased? Why is it? Why do you think that so much of your money is going into a military machine that is just making things worse? Like, do you think we made things better in Iraq compared to Saddam Hussein? And it's worse. We made it worse by what we did by going into Iraq. And there at the time there was still like a lot more pushback. These soldiers had cameras on like their helmets. There was so much footage of like what these soldiers were actually doing when they were going into people's homes and terrorizing them. It was really messed up. Um, so we have to realize that, we are burning the village, and it's not to save the village, it's to just burn the village. And we're burning everything, including our own villages in this process. We are being burned by it. And it's very clear after like, almost like 100 years of war, nobody who's partaking in this is benefiting. You have to realize that you're being suckered into something.
Yeah. That's paramilitary, which I'm so pumped to do your book. That is probably one of my biggest takeaways after this conversation, just how many times you referenced it. I was like, I did not realize how much I'm missing out on.
Yes.
Which I guess would be a great time, Cynthia. Lovely. Will you tell everybody where to find that book and where you are?
Sure. The best place is my Substack page, Through a Glass Darkly, by Cynthia Chung. Make sure you write my name because there's a few Through Glass Darklys. And my book is The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set, which you can find info on my Substack very easily on this because you can get it on Amazon. Unfortunately, it's hard for us to find other things other than Amazon, but you can also buy the PDF off of us through Gumroad. Or if you do a subscription, an annual subscription to my Substack, I also send it to people personally by email as well. And don't forget the risingtidefoundation.net website, which is something that I co-founded with my husband. It's a non-profit and it goes through a lot of cultural, historical stuff. We have weekly lectures by presenters, a different presenter every week. Madison's going to do one in a few weeks, and hopefully Macy will do one. It was a real pleasure talking to you guys.
For sure. Well, Maddie, just like say thank you and whatever.
Cynthia, thank you and whatever.
Great, we'll end it like that. We literally will end it like that.